LitFestX. We're joined by Shweta Taneja. She's an author, journalist, and a graphic novelist with a passion for speculative fiction. She's written 6 books and about, if I'm reading it correctly, 200 articles in a
Yes.
career spanning over 13 years. Her latest book is called Cult of Chaos. It was published in late 2014 and has got some very positive media reviews. Incidentally, Shweta has just learned and informed us that she has won the prestigious fellowship called the Charles Wallace Fellowship, run by the British Council for 2015-16, where she will be one of 3 authors from India going to the UK. So congratulations on that, Shweta.
Thank you very much, Kumar.
And welcome to LitFestX.
Thanks. Nice to be here. It's a very exciting time for me.
Great. Shweta, since you're so passionate about, speculative fiction, and clearly there's a lot of that in the Indian mythology writing space. I mean, in the last decade or so, we've seen an unprecedented boom in the mytho writing space, if you will. And, tell us a little more about what else is happening there and what developments do you see beyond mythology in speculative fiction writing?
Okay, Kumar, so what has, right now, as you mentioned rightly, that mythology is trending. It's everywhere and it's selling really well as well in India. So mythology is sort of a subgenre of speculative fiction, which will include other genres like horror and, fantasy, urban fantasy, high fantasy like Lord of the Rings, for example, or even, supernatural fiction, horror. So speculative fiction is a bigger genre, so to say, and mythology is one of them, which is becoming really popular in India. So I see a good future for this genre in the country, because it's generally, internationally, if you look at it, it's generally liked by youngsters. And there are a lot of subgenres in this, which I'm hoping come up in the country as well as we see it. I mean, my book Cult of Chaos was one of the urban fantasies that have come out, which were one of the first ones to come out, and already the response has been really exciting about it. So yeah, I'm hoping that the speculative fiction comes out of the mythology genre and kind of moves on into other subgenres as well.
So when you're talking about other subgenres, give us an example.
Okay, so I'll tell you. So there are like various types of speculative fiction. There's science fiction, for example, right? And then there's fantasy. Fantasy is what you would think of, like, say, what is that? The Hunger Games series, for example, right? And then there's horror. Horror is also included in the speculative fiction genre. Mythology as well is included. Variations of mythology is included. Then there's utopia or dystopia sort of fiction, which is you're imagining the future of your space and seeing how society will go on in the future. So that's also in a way science fiction, but it's not like technology. And then there's like alternate history. So you imagine that Gandhi never happened, for example. What will happen to our country? So that's also a type of speculative fiction. So all these subgenres are like major work of writing internationally in themselves. And then there's last one, the urban fantasy, where, for example, like I mentioned, Cult of Chaos, and there are many other. Harry Potter, for example, is an urban fantasy which is based in London, but it is also talking about the supernatural layers of London, right? It's not only contemporary London. So there are different types of these speculative fiction that can be explored in the country, and I'm hoping that there are new authors who come up and try to experiment with these forms.
Right. There's a lot of interest clearly on looking at newer forms of writing speculative fiction. And are you seeing a lot more interest, not just amongst readers, but bloggers, newer writers who must have approached you for tips and sort of guidance?
Yes, definitely. I know people who are coming to me and talking about subgenres, right? A lot of people don't know these words like urban fantasy. I have a really funny story. I'll tell you a little later on this. on how I had to explain it to the publishers, distributors, on what urban fantasy is. Because they weren't aware at that time when this book was published what urban fantasy would be like. They didn't know the subgenre. So yeah, so there are a lot of young writers who are experimenting with forms as well as language, as well as say short story, novel, game, interactive fiction, and they are all doing interesting science fiction stuff, comics, for example. So a lot of experimentative stuff is coming up, and there is readership for it also. I know, because bloggers are writing about it. They're wishing that somebody writes a epic fiction like the J.R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones series, right? So somebody writes that in the Indian context. They are some of the readers are bored of mythology, and they want to kind of move on to into new types of fantasy, say horror, or or science fiction. Like, I am going to do a science fiction after I finish this series that I'm writing. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening in this space, and I'm pretty excited to be there right now, and hoping that I can go into new directions for speculative fiction.
You know, so you mentioned you're also, you've started writing a new series, which is an urban fantasy. And, how's been the experience of changing from one genre to the other, very quickly?
So it was definitely challenging. For example, I started with mythology. My first two novels were graphic novels, comics, 100 plus pages, which were one was on Krishna and one was on Shiva. So like others, I started in mythology as well, but I wanted to experiment with the genres too a lot. So then and I love detective fiction on one side. So I thought I'll combine detective fiction as well as my love of mythology into one fiction, which is where I found this urban fantasy space, in which Ananta Taneja, is the character in the book, is a tantric detective, and she's solving supernatural crime. It's this dark thing, a dark kind of a fantasy that I wanted to build up. It was definitely challenging, but was good fun to write as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Um, did you always want to create fantasy fiction? I mean, where did you sort of develop this liking for it, or what got you onto this journey then?
So about 8, 9 years ago, a friend of mine kind of introduced me to the genre fantasy, and I've been crazy reading it since then. So when I decided to write 6 years ago, write fiction. I mean, I was writing journal. I was a journalist since 13 years. I've been a journalist. So that was because I loved reading all these books. That was the first thing that I thought of writing about, right? In a story space. So unfortunately, now that I write fantasy, I cannot read fantasy because, invariably you unconsciously kind of take on, inspiration, or as writer, you kind of soak up the other writers' format. So I started to read high literary fiction now to kind of write my own style of fantasy. But this Ananta Tantrist happened because I wanted to read a fiction which had a Indian female detective, who was like this kick-ass sort of character who's like doing all kinds of adventures. And I couldn't find an author who had written this kind of a book. So I was like, okay, what the hell, I'll write it.
Nice. And how difficult was it then to convince your publishers and distributors about the new urban fantasy book you're writing?
It was difficult. So for example, this book is for adults, right? It's not for children. There was a lot of urban fantasy in the country for kids. So what was the problem was that whenever I pitched it to a publisher, they will pick it up and they will say, oh, this is for kids, but it is too violent. And I'm trying to tell them it's adult fantasy. So it'll have like, elements of violence. It'll have elements of blood. It's tantrism. So it has to be a dark fantasy. So it was difficult to convince HarperCollins. In fact, I have this really funny story that I tell now and then. Ajita from HarperCollins is my editor of this series, and I met her at a literature festival. Okay, now that we're talking about literature festivals, and I told her, I think Anantya likes you and she wants you to be her editor. And it was just a week that I had sent the book to her, and she totally creeped out. I think I had met her for the first time. She totally creeped out. So then finally, she was like, okay. And it took 6 months to convince her, but I was able to convince her. So that's how it was. But she's one of those who likes to read these kind of genres as well. So it made it a little easier. But there were a lot of rejections from publishers who couldn't, fit the book in a box. They couldn't fit it in young adults fiction, or they couldn't fit it in like say fantasy is meant for young adults. So it was a lot of subsets of many boxes, so they couldn't do it. So yeah, that's what happened with the book. But it's history. HarperCollins picked it up.
Okay. And so tell us a little bit more about the character Anantya Tantrist in your new book.
So Anantya is a 23-year-old. She's based in Delhi. And she's a tantric detective by choice. She's the only female tantric around. In fact, her world is much more violent than our world, and our world is increasingly becoming intolerant and violent as we see it. But hers is still, I would say, a couple of steps away from that. It's the tantric world. She solves supernatural crime, and she's had to struggle with. She's an independent woman living in Delhi. You know how Delhi can be. She's had to struggle with a lot of past issues, which I explored in the book as well, which has made her very strong, aggressive, kick-ass sort of character. So I call her Superman sort of a thing, female Superman version in that sense. So that's who she is. She's pretty cool. I like her.
Right. I know you wanted to also talk a little bit about some NGO work that you're doing. Please go ahead on that.
Yes, so it's not really. I'm involved in a little way that I can, and I would request all the viewers who are watching, as well as Kumar, you. So there's this little school in Kalap, a village in Uttaranchal, where a friend of mine is running, has just opened a school, and he wants 80 kids in that village to be well educated. So he wants people like us to sponsor the kids. So it takes about 8 to 9,000 a year to sponsor one kid's education. I have done my part, but I've also opened it up on my website and requested if any of you watching, or later on if anyone watches, if you would like to sponsor a kid, they're looking for 30 more sponsorships. If you'd like to sponsor a kid, please go ahead. And if you write back to me and let me know on that, I'll send you a signed copy of Cult of Chaos, Anantya, a dark fantasy to be read in like when electricity goes off, which should happen soon with me as well.
Great. We'll take a couple of quick questions coming on the Twitter feed. Okay. Before, like you mentioned, your power cut is likely to take place right now in Bangalore.
Yes.
So, the question is going to show up on your screen just right now.
Okay, great.
And the question is, would you take the chance of your book being turned into a movie?
Oh, of course, Arang. I would love to. I mean, if it happens, most of the whenever a movie happens, the book is there are, as you would know if you're a reader, that the elements of the book, the descriptions, the details of the book kind of have to go away. So if I find a director who understands Anantya really well and takes her character into a new story, why not? I mean, it'll be really nice. Yeah.
Right. And speaking of books and movies, you have been writing about the power of speculative fiction, and in various of your columns, has that power of creating Anantya the tantrist given something back to you? Has that experience done something to you?
It's a very interesting question, Kumar, that you asked. In fact, when I began writing the book, I didn't think it'll do anything to me in that sense. So, Anantya is in many ways a complete inversion of all Indian woman ideas, the values that we think Indian women should have, the ideal Indian woman sort of a thing. She's a complete inversion. So I grew up in Delhi as well, and now since many years I've been living in Bangalore. So when I was writing her, I was visiting the same streets that I grew up in, the same roads that I grew up on, uh, with her. And she's a much more confident, aggressive character than I used to be at that time. And while writing her, I revisited these streets, and suddenly, one book later, I realized, okay, I can be more confident as well. I want to reclaim my streets too. I don't want to be scared walking on the road. So I'm more confrontational, all thanks to her in a way. So it's been, maybe it's kind of a psychological thing I have no idea about, but it's been quite fascinating creating her and knowing that if Ananta can do it, I can do it. And that's the whole idea that I want to put into women, in their 20s or teens, saying that okay, I can do anything. I have somebody to look up to. So I wish in an inverted way Ananta becomes an ideal for girls as well, right? So that's my hope. I mean, it's a personal thing, so I've done it myself. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you obviously writing a lot. I mean, as your earlier, introduction spoke of. Um do you find time to do other stuff? I mean, what are you doing when you're not creating, fantasy fiction or creating characters like Anantya Tantric?
So I walk a lot and I run. But that's fitness thing. You have to be active, otherwise you're like sitting in one corner. And I go out with my friends, hang out with them, but I do not have like serious hobbies to pursue except writing. So in fact, I just like chill out in a bit, watch a lot of crazy movies, read a lot of books. And my husband's a drummer, so when he's practicing, I sit in a corner and write. So I'm that boring. I just write, nothing else.
Great. Well, Shweta, we hope to see, good writing from you as always, and good luck with your upcoming book. And all power to Anantya the Tantric. And good luck is all I can say. And I know I'm cognizant of the fact that you mentioned that at this point in time your power might get cut off. So
I know we're making it quick and sweet. Good.
yeah, rather than ending the session abruptly, we'll just say our goodbyes to you and to the audience in an orderly fashion.
All right. Thank you so much, Kumar, for having me on the show. It was good fun. All the best for LitFest in future. Whatever great plans, grand plans you have for it.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.